Hey everyone, so it's good to be here. I am going to talk about my explorations in art and technology, so let's start from the beginning, I guess. So when I was a kid, I always enjoyed playing with technology. I'd wander around the house and take things apart and put them back together again, and sometimes they'd still work afterwards. I grew up a bit and I went to university and I studied math and computer science at university, and in my head, I was just going to go on a typical career path that a lot of people imagine for someone who's got a computer science degree. I was going to get a job in CS and work for a games company or a bank or something. And I did that for a while. I worked for a games company, a bank, as I worked as a web designer. I did quite a lot of different careers, but most of them didn't really give me a creative kick that I wanted. And I hadn't really been exposed to the demo scene or using art using technology in art context. And one of the web design agencies I was working at, there was someone doing creative coding with a framework called processing, and this really inspired me, so I started playing around with it and making bits of art. And after a while, people started saying the things I was making were art, because at the time I was just making things for fun, and eventually people were like, oh, that looks like a piece of art. So I decided to go to this place, Los Angeles, and get a master's in art, so that people would be able to tell me what art was, because I had no idea really, so I thought it would be good to go and have other people tell me for a couple of years. So while I was there thinking, what should I make art about? I guess it was pretty meta. I ended up making art about technology, using technology. I guess a lot of the way we interact with technology is this way, through screens. And we think of screens as pretty intuitive, but they're actually really not that intuitive at all. We evolved to interact and perceive the world in 3 dimensions. And yet we sit and spend all day, every day, staring at a little grass rectangle. And it's also, we like to imagine if we're surfing the internet, that maybe we're experiencing the world via these screens. So for instance, if you're looking at a picture of a beach, you might like to think that you've experienced the beach, but the experience you're having, like in your brain, you're probably triggering very similar neural pathways to the experience you'd be triggering if you were looking at Facebook or Twitter or procrastinating in some other type of way. You're still performing the same action with your body. You're still in the same place. So I think it's very easy to fall into the trap of thinking screens and images give us this way to experience the world, when in fact we are just staring at a screen a lot of time. So it's also not just getting information from screens. It's also the way we put information into the digital world is pretty standard and pretty arbitrary. We spend a lot of time in front of keyboards and mouses and touch screens, and we actually mediate a lot of our experience through these devices. So even though they're part of our lives and we take them for granted, I think it's good to realize that possibly the way we've ended up there is slightly arbitrary. And so a lot of my work is trying to explore ways we can use new technology to maybe decontextualize technology a bit, make people think about imaginative uses of technology. One of the first pieces of technology art I made was using a multi-touch display. And when the multi-touch display first became available, it was a really mind-blowing piece of technology. For the first time in a computer user interface, you could actually touch something on a screen and that thing would move in the same place as you touched it. And one of the first ways that people first became aware of multi-touch technology was through this guy, Jeff Han. He gave a presentation at a conference, at the TED conference, and gave a recipe for makers to be able to make their own touchscreen displays. So I started playing around, and this is my first ever tablet computer. Basically, it had a webcam underneath and just detected shadows as you touched the top of it. So I thought it would be good to start experimenting with this type of technology and build an installation based on that. So I built this installation that would show people pieces of artwork, and then they would get to copy the pieces of artwork. And gradually over time, it would take everyone's attempt at copying the piece of artwork and average it out. And I was interested to see if this would lead to something that looked like the original piece of artwork. So here's Marilyn Monroe painting on the left and the copies on the right. And here's the hungry caterpillar on the left and the copies on the right. And yeah, I'm not quite sure what this is, but people also got quite excited and got engaged creatively. And I think this is a really great way to connect to people if you're making technological experiences, is to try and engage their creative urges. So one thing that we noticed when we put this installation up was when you didn't have a paintbrush there, people just interacted with it like a screen. But as soon as you put a paintbrush there, people's whole demeanor changed, and they started to engage the parts of their brain that they used when they were in art class in school, and they started to act more like a painter. And I think one of the reasons for that is hands. Hands are really awesome, and we spend a lot of time, again, using these pretty arbitrary interfaces, but as soon as you can kind of engage 3 dimensions of an interface, you get a lot more nuance, a lot more space to manipulate interfaces and manipulate the digital world. And this really fascinated me, so I thought I would like to explore projection mapping with this next installation. But I wanted to make a projection mapping that you could actually manipulate with your hands. So I did what most people do when they start exploring projection mapping, and I generated some kind of generative geometry that I wanted to turn into a 3-dimensional object. And I did that using a creative coding toolkit called Open Frameworks. So Open Frameworks is a C++ library that lets you draw pictures, make sounds, take input from the world. It makes it very easy to make creative projects. So I generated this mesh using that software, and I used this device, which is a CNC mill, to create this 3-dimensional abstract form in real life. So a CNC mill is like the opposite of a 3D printer. A 3D printer adds material to something you're trying to create, whereas a CNC mill takes material away. And when you tell the CNC mill what to do, you have to tell it exactly where it's going to go. So here are the toolpaths that I made for my little mesh-based projection mapping thing. And then that's what it looked like in real life. So this was an art school project, so I didn't have that much budget. So it's a lot smaller than I wanted it to be. But I then went about trying to work out how to map it. And I wrote some projection mapping software that would allow you to model projectors in 3-dimensional space and tell the software what their relationship to this object was. So after playing around a bit, this is what I came up with. It seems to be no sound. So basically, I made a system whereby there was a sensor at the back of this object, and as people manipulated it, it could tell which way up the object was pointed, and it would then change the orientation of the projection accordingly. And there was also a physics engine integrated with it, so that as the orientation of the object changed, these glowing balls of light would seem to fall through it. So this was a really fun toy, and people really liked playing with it, but one thing I noticed, it was very much a toy. People interacted with it for 5 or 10 minutes, and then they got bored and moved on to the next thing. It didn't really grasp them in any capacity beyond just something that was fun. So for the next piece, I wanted to tell a story, work out a way in which I could engage people on a more emotional level by adding a bit of narrative to my work. And that opportunity came about when a friend of mine started talking to me about an Adult Swim show about hair. And we decided it would be a good idea to tell a story about a wig that was also robotic. It seemed like a great proposition, something that would save you time when you're putting your makeup on in the morning. So we played around for a while, and this is the invention that we ended up with. So this device uses a combination of electronics, but also puppetry. We realized after a while of building this thing that we could have put a lot of time and effort into making the whole thing purely digital, purely electronic, but it was actually a lot easier to get expressive movement if we made part of it based on puppetry. So this woman was a great sport. She apparently used to be a soap star in the Netherlands in the 80s. And we went to her office with this device we had built, and she looked very scared of what we had prepared for her. It was kind of like a hard hat with a wig attached to the top of it. But on the day, she was super into it and played along really well. So I guess you get the general gist of that, but this guy was really the star of the show. You saw him for a couple of seconds at the beginning, and he was one of the elements that was puppeted, so I was sitting behind her the whole time, puppeting her, and at one point, one of the lights we were using broke, so we decided to replaced the light with another light that the studio had. And they didn't actually tell us that this was a light that was meant for still photography. So I sat there next to it all day, and it was actually emitting lots of UV radiation. So this is what I looked like at the end of the day. So this is one of my first projects, I guess, where I was making a complicated, useless machine. And I think this is where a lot of my work has gone since then. I find exploring like the surreal and absurd element of technology really lets you make people take another look at technology. By like decontextualizing technology and also the objects you put in your installations, it lets people think again about technology. People's ideas about technology are often very confined to things they've already experienced. So I think it's very valuable when technology can be anything we want it to be, to reawaken people's imaginations by making stupid things. So this next project I'm going to talk about thinks about technology and thinks about maybe our effects that we have on the world with technology. So we put a lot of junk in the sea and we damage fish habitats all the time. So I decided it would be a great idea to empower a fish to be able to break some of our habitats. I thought it would be good to give a goldfish control of a hammer somehow. So here's my fish, and for some reason I got obsessed with trying to make the hammer travel in a semicircular path around the aquarium. And I'm not sure why I did this, probably because I like difficult engineering challenges, because it would have been much easier for the hammer just to travel backwards and forwards in front of the fish. And I think this is a real danger when you're working with technology as well. It's often quite appealing to make things complicated just because the actual act of engineering complicated things is almost as attractive as the end goal that you're trying to reach. But it's really good to keep in mind that people don't care about the engineering, really. They care about what they see at the end. Anyway, I got the chance to make my fish hammer at this company, Autodesk, who are in the Bay. They run a residency program where they let you play with lots of their fun toys. So I started playing with my fish hammer drive mechanism. This is the first prototype I came up with. They have a water jet cutter there, so I cut a gear on a water jet cutter. And this is what the second prototype of my fish hammer drive mechanism ended up looking like. So after a while, my fish hammer drive mechanism was working okay, and then I had to work out how to track my fish. This wasn't too hard, actually, because a fish is a fairly bright color. So if you put a fish in front of a completely different color, it's very easy to differentiate between those two colors using OpenCV. Again, the software I used to write this was something called Open Frameworks, which is a great resource if you're a coder and looking to branch out into the physical world or the screen-based world. So I'll play you the video of what this installation ended up looking like. So you can see the fish here, and there's a webcam above tracking him. I actually had to display this in a corporate environment. They had a pretty strong health and safety policy. So it took a lot of convincing that the fish wasn't going to destroy little children's fingers, but I managed to convince them in the end that my fish was only slightly violent, not very violent. So that's Smashy, the smashing goldfish. So like I say, what I learned in this project is that all of this amazing engineering is not important at all. Smashy is the real star of the show, and the hammer is the real star of the show. So I think also it's a trap that's really easy to fall into when you're developing things like VR, is you give people a VR headset and they get seduced by the technology. I think when you're developing for technology, it's good to try and do exactly what you need to do and express emotion and narrative rather than just playing with toys. Anyway, I really liked how people experienced this installation, because there was a whole other world of like them empathizing with the fish, trying to imagine what it would be like to be the fish. And I decided I'd make another small animal-based piece of art. This time I decided it would be good to empower hamsters to be able to take selfies, because I don't think there are enough hamsters in the art world. It's basically a self-portrait device for hamsters rather than hipsters. And in the creation of this device, I became slightly obsessed with the way we store information. When we have like all of the world's information at our fingertips on these tiny devices, we kind of take it for granted that this is the way things have always been. On the screen here, you can see a piece of art by a guy called Michael Mandiberg, and he printed out the whole of Wikipedia. Well, he didn't actually print out the whole of Wikipedia, because that would have been a huge waste of paper, but he made this installation where there was wallpaper showing how much space it would have taken up, and he printed out a few copies. But anyway, I became kind of obsessed with this analog way of storing information, and was wondering if I could store the information for the hamster portrait in some kind of analog way. So I started looking into cams and mechanical systems for storing information, and this seemed like a really fun way to try and encode a hamster drawing. So I wrote some software that would trace out a hamster drawing and then simulated a machine that I would like to build. And in the process of simulating a machine I'd like to build and also tracing out a hamster drawing, traced out another part of the machine that I could then fabricate and then run in reverse to create this hamster drawing. That was a theory anyway. So again, I went back to a CNC mill and milled some cams that would make a hamster drawing. And I thought it hadn't worked at all, but luckily for me, there was a 5-centimeter error in one of my parts. So after rejigging everything a little bit, it actually worked, and this is the final hamster piece. So the hamster's not actually there. This is a telepresence hamster. I've had like angry emails from people being like, I can't believe you're keeping a hamster in a tiny cage in an art gallery. The hamster was actually at home chilling in his house. So there's the hamster piece, and I think people really enjoyed this piece, but they kept wanting to interact with it. They kept wanting to go up to it and turn it themselves and play with the pen, and so I thought it would be good to get back to making something that would be more interactive. And I also really enjoyed the fish smashing piece. I think people really enjoy seeing things smashed, so I kind of smashed those two ideas together and came up with this idea to make an slightly smashy, interactive piece. Here you can see an art piece by a guy called Ken Feingold called Hell, and you have these two chatbots talking to each other in robot form. So I thought it might be fun to make something that was similar to maybe the experience of speaking to a chatbot on the phone. When you phone up like an airline, you try and get through to someone, you just end up speaking to a robot. I tried to think of a way that I could maybe make that more physical. So I decided to interpret that experience as you speaking into some kind of installation, and then your words would then get abused somehow. And what I ended up with was a foot robot. So I took a few molds of my friend's feet. It turns out if you make a solid mold of someone's foot, it's pretty heavy. It doesn't make for good robot feet. So that's a great tip for any of you out there who are looking to make badly made robot feet. So I ended up using this, which is a manicure foot. So I had the robot foot idea, and then I was like, how can I speak into this installation that would be interesting? So then I found this old guy in Los Angeles who had been collecting these brass instruments for years and years and years, and he took me into his lair and gave me some interesting bits of brass. And I went back to my lab and rejigged this all together and wrote some software, and this is what I ended up with. Hello? Are you listening to me?
2. Listening.
Find the nearest coffee shop. Mary had a little lamb.
Marry.
What's your favorite color?
Is.
You know, that doesn't even make sense.
Sense.
And so people would speak into this thing, and then their words would go from the real world to the virtual world, and then if they went back through the right-hand horn, they would come back out into the world as sound again. People also seem to really like trying to break this thing. They often said anti-disestablishmentarianism and supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. And unbeknownst to me, those two words both broke the thing because they would shoot up into the ceiling and be too long for the physics engine to deal with, and so they'd end up outside of the box just hanging there. So you would get these like strings of long words hanging there. But it was cool. They disappeared after a while. But people like to break things. So anything you make, you should try and test to the full extent possible. But I guess this was my first mixed reality piece of art. And there's a lot of hype around this at the moment. This is a Time magazine cover about the founder of Oculus. I guess Time magazine didn't really get the memo that virtual reality is actually meant to be cool. A lot of people have speculated about what's going on here. Luckily, the internet managed to work out that Parmalatchi was actually on a horseback riding holiday with Vladimir Putin. So the internet is a great resource for finding out what's really going on in the world. But I think VR is a really great thing, but it maybe offers some solutions to some of the problems I'm talking about of being trapped in front of screens all day, every day, but it also offers a lot of the same problems. And it's down to you people as developers to really fight against this tide, to make this your platform, to make it something that's going to be used for creative and purposes which enrich people's lives rather than just as another advertising platform. And people are already trying to do this. This piece is a piece by a artist in the UK called Marshmallow Laserfeast, where they took people out to the forest and gave them animal vision in the forest. So, I mean, I like this on many levels. It's making people contemplate nature. It's making people have an experience together. So I think when you're working with technology, it's really good to try and think of ways to use technology to connect people rather than just to continue on this, like, how can we get people to stare at screens longer? And phones are great, but they also do suck a lot of our time. And so I think also when you're developing for phones, it's great to think about ways that you can make apps which make people's lives more human rather than more staring into phony, if that is an adjective. I don't think it is. Anyway, I decided it would be good to make a piece about all of these phones, because everyone has loads of junk phones sitting around, and I thought it would be nice to make a piece which repurposed these phones. And there's actually a Samsung upcycling stall outside if you're interested in upcycling phones. But I thought it would be good to take some people's old phones and turn them into something beautiful. So I started thinking about, what aspects of phones do I think makes phones phony? And I came across the noise. The ring can be quite intrusive sometimes in people's lives. You're kind of sitting there and relaxing, and suddenly you have this like shrill pitch interrupting you. So I started to think of times in people's lives when they find tweeting and shrill pitches like a good thing. And I came upon birds. People seem to love bird songs. So it's like Rama was saying in the previous talk, you've got to smash ideas together. So I decided to smash together the two ideas of birdsong and phones, and I came up with some robotic mobile phone birds. So there are a few of these in a tree, and you could phone them, and they would flap their wings, and then they would start phoning each other. I've got a little video of it here. So this is one of the first documentation videos I ever made, and it's pretty rubbish. So if you're going to document any of your stuff, it's really important to get good footage, because I was pretty sad at the end of this, only having like limited footage to work with. But it was really beautiful seeing how people, young and old, both like immediately understood what these things were, yet were in kind of awe about them. And each of them actually had cell service, but one thing I noticed is that if you're going to make things which do have cell service, be careful to use providers which have cell service everywhere you want to display the piece. So the great thing here was like we started with a palette of junk rather than a palette of what's the newest, shiniest technology I can get my hands on. And that really led to a more a process which involves a lot more play. And I think that's a really healthy thing in technology, because it's very easy to approach with an engineering mindset and get distracted from the fact that if you're trying to create art of technology, it should be a playful process rather than I've got this engineering problem, I'm going to go from A to B and get to the end of this engineering problem, and then you don't leave any space for discovery. So people really like this project, and it was commissioned for another version which was shown in the UK. This is my V2.0 system diagram. For V2.0, people couldn't call it themselves because of this self-service problem I told you about. So we decided to have this old phone in the corner that people could use to call the birds. And whenever kids came to the exhibition, they're like, what the hell is this thing? And I think it's a really great illustration of the arbitrariness of interfaces. Like, to me, this is like a completely obvious way to dial a phone number. And then this like 12-year-old kid comes in and it's like, what the hell is this? And like it would break every like 3 to 4 days because kids would just like rip the dial off because they had no idea how to use it. But yeah, I think that's a great illustration of interfaces and their clunkiness. But what really inspired me about this project was this use of trash and being able to recycle stuff. It's very tempting when you're making art technology just to go for the newest, shiniest toys you can see, especially because they're often the most hyped ones. So another chance I had to work with junk was when a printer company came to me, and they wanted me to make a printer orchestra. So this isn't a new or fresh idea. People have been doing this since the 60s or 70s, but it's an idea. It's an area which has so much rich heritage and possibility. It's something that I thought would be fun to do. So we went to the dump to find. There's some people who resell this kind of e-waste. So we went there to try and find some junk to bring back to our studio. And I think they were a bit confused about what we were doing, trawling through all of the e-waste, trying to listen to what kind of sounds like lids of things made and drawers of things made. But we got some trash back to our studio, and we decided we were going to make music mainly with these two things. The thing on the left is a stepper motor, and it works by rotating one step at a time. So one full rotation might be 200 steps. But the great thing about this is you can step it at the same frequency as a musical note. So basically, music is just a sequence of repetitive waves. So if you step this motor at the same frequency as those waves, you get a sound which is the same frequency as a musical note out. And the thing on the right here is what your car uses to open and close the door locks. So that seemed like a really good thing to use for percussive elements and to open and close things. So we started playing around, and this is like our first test. So yeah, we had some neighbors in our studio there, and they were none too impressed with our machine orchestra, but we thought it was pretty cool. One thing we learned in that process was it's good to mass produce things if you can mass produce them, because there were so many cables and wires and components. So we came up with this printed circuit board that would drive all the printers. It had like a MIDI in and a MIDI through, so we could chain together these circuit boards from a computer. And then you had various ins and outs, but the most useful ones for us were the stepper motor outs. So we started trying to compose music for this orchestra. And I think this was a very stressful process for the composer, because normally he has a palette of sounds in front of him. And suddenly he's like, I have no idea what any of this is going to sound like. So we would record things and send them to him, and he would try and put it together. But it kind of almost worked in the end. This is his Logic window, and you can see down the left there's like lots of different labels for the things he was working with. But eventually, it all more or less came together, so we got ready to load in. So the advertising agency who commissioned this, I don't think they were familiar with technical projects, and they'd only budgeted enough for us to have one day in the studio to set up. So this whole process was pretty stressful. We also thought, because we were using lots of recycled junk to make the sounds, it'd be great to use recycled power supplies as well. That was also a really bad idea, because when we got to the day, we started hearing lots of pops and explosions at the back as all these power supplies started giving up. So recycled stuff is good, but not always. This is what I looked like at the end of that process. And this is what we came up with in the end. So that was a really great experience, but the main sad thing about that is whenever people saw it and came up to me afterwards, they'd be like, oh, that was really great, but they didn't believe it actually happened for real. They thought it was too complicated and too crazy and we couldn't have done it. So that made me really sad. And we tried really hard to convince the advertising agency to give us more budget to do a real live installation where we still had all these hundreds of instruments built, but they just didn't have the budget for it. So I think it's really crucial, especially when you're considering projects like this, to explore ideas to their full potential and do as much with it as you can, especially if it's something that's live like that. If people can actually experience it, they're going to have so much more of an enjoyable experience. But after that, I got into this idea of making music with stepper motors, so I decided to find another object that I could make music with, and that happened to be a My Little Pony. So I started playing around trying to make a My Little Pony-based music machine. So you get the idea there. The interesting thing about this was, like, even though the previous printer advert had a budget which was orders of magnitude more than this actually has more hits on Vimeo than the printer orchestra. So I think when you're thinking about making creative projects, it's not just about the scale, it's also about the content. People obviously prefer My Little Pony and Action Man than they do old printers. I'm going to skip this project because I am running out of time. I'm going to talk about another musical project. Sorry to bore you with all these musical projects. So after the My Little Pony experience, I was still pretty inspired by making machine music. So I didn't really know what I was going to make machine music with next. So I went to the 99-cent store and started to look around and was browsing through the aisles and came upon the knife section, and that seemed like a fun thing to play with, just because people have this emotional relationship to knives already, whether it's through cooking or hunting. They mean something to people, and it's an interesting way to latch on to experiences people have already had. So I bought a load of 99-cent knives and took them back to my studio and started playing around. I quickly learned that new knives are pretty sharp, so I rigged up a system so that I wouldn't cut my fingers off in the process of making this, because, solenoid power meat cleavers are pretty dangerous, it turns out. I started experimenting with other ways I could make them move and make them make sound. I'm going to show you this video very quickly. I'm running out of sound, so I might fast forward it a little bit. Oh, sorry. Come on, PowerPoint. You can do this. So this was as much a sculptural project as a musical project. It was fun just seeing different ways I could arrange the knives with see-through acrylic to get interesting effects. One thing I really liked about this project was when the piece wasn't playing music, seeing how people interacted with it. They thought it was some kind of scary experience. And as soon as the piece started playing music, it became a much more playful experience. So it's really interesting seeing the way that technology can decontextualize objects like this and change them instantaneously from something that's super scary into something that people can immediately relate to. So you get the idea there. And another thing I like to do is share a lot of the stuff I make. I'm building stuff on the shoulders of giants, like the bits of software I use, for instance, Open Frameworks or Arduino, are all built by other people for me. So I like to share code as much as I can. So you can work out how to build your own Jacob's Ladder with knives on Instructables. It's probably the only Instructable on the whole website that you can probably cut and electrocute yourself at the same time in the process of building. The code for that is also on GitHub. It will give you some code that will just easily let you step motors at musical frequencies. And I'm going to talk about another musical project. This time I decided to make a rock band, but not that type of rock band, this type of rock band. Turns out rocks are actually pretty annoying if you want to treat them as uniform objects, because they're not uniform objects. They're all different shapes. So I had to come up with some kind of machinery that would sort and deal with rocks in ways that would let me create sounds with them on a regular basis. So here's a kind of rock dispenser I built. It didn't really work that well because the rocks were all different shapes. So one way that I came up with in the end of like making sounds with rocks is using magnetic rocks. It's a bit of a cheat, but hematite has quite a high iron content, so you can pick it up with a magnet and throw it. So this is my first prototype of a magnetic rock throwing machine. It's all laser cut plastic with a little bit of aluminum in the middle and a neodymium rare earth magnet. And I decided to scale up to see if that would work in a bigger way, and it did. So here's my little test rig in my studio. Well, it's not my studio, actually. This is when I was doing an artist's residency, so this is at Autodesk's workshop. But that all seemed to work. So prototyping is really useful when you're building this kind of stuff. So after I'd made a prototype in plywood, I went to this machine, which is a really fun toy. It's a water jet cutter, and it allows you to cut through solid metal. So that's like an inch thick aluminum, and that machine just blasts through it with very high PSI water mixed with garnet. Other instruments I wanted to explore were xylophones. So using that water jet cutter, you can cut like a sheet of aluminum into xylophone keys. I wrote a bit of software where you could input the different material properties of a material, like the thickness and the Young's modulus, etc., and it would give you a vector file back to output xylophone keys. So I used that to generate some xylophone keys and started experimenting with a way of making a mechanical xylophone that was based on solenoids. This is another prototype made out of laser cut plywood you can see here. And this is the final project. So it's interesting. You can see the two big rock throwing devices at the side, and they're probably the instruments that took the most time, but they make a pretty unsatisfying ka-chunk sound every time they throw a rock. But aesthetically, they're pretty cool. So it's an interesting balancing act between aesthetics and art and engineering when you're trying to work with these kind of materials. And again, I put this piece on Instructables, so if you want to make a mechanical xylophone, go ahead. So I think my key message from most of my explorations would be to use technology to create unique experiences. With most of my pieces, I want to use technology in what I hope are unexpected ways to maybe get people to reconsider what technology is. And I think that's true of developing for any platform, whether it's VR or mobile or anything. It's, if you just build incrementally on what already exists, you're not necessarily doing the best or the correct thing. You might do something that people understand more easily, but if you want to create a more human experience, it's good to just kind of wipe your brain clean of technological experiences as much as you can and try and latch on to other experiences people have had in their lives, other more human experiences. So that is the last slide of my presentation. Thank you for listening. You can see my work on my website. It's there just under my name, www.neilmendoza.com. I have an Instagram, which I update rarely. My website is probably the best place, or my Twitter also is a good place. I normally update my Twitter with all of my new projects, so if you want to follow me on Twitter, that's a good place. Yes, you at the back.
Did you ever do something with cats?
With cats? No. They are very hard to control. They don't seem to be that into being artists. It's not something. Yes. Hello?
Do you use contact mics when you document the project, or it sounds like the sound?
Yeah, like for most of the musical projects, the easiest way I found is to mic up each instrument separately and just record each instrument separately and mix it down afterwards. Just a lot of them are like displayed in rooms with pretty bad acoustics, so if you're just trying to record it from one place, it's hard to recreate the audio experience. So yeah, that's the best way I found of documenting those kind of things.
Do you do your own video, or do you work with
I normally edit my own videos or work with different cinematographers to try and capture stuff in a nice way, but I mostly do my own edits. Cool. Thank you very much.